Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Using Data Intelligence to Build Deeper Client Relationships. I'm Johnny Swift of Impact Communications, and I'll be your host today for this insightful webinar featuring John O'Connell of the Oasis Group alongside Dan Kavanaugh and Erica Maynard of AI Identified, where they'll be discussing how data intelligence is transforming the advisor-client relationship, how data intelligence helping advisors build deeper client relationships. So before we jump in, I want to give a quick intro to each of our guests. Dan Kavanaugh is the General Manager of Wealth Management and Financial Advisory, the SVP and Head of Data as a Service at AI Identified, which is an AI-powered wealth network intelligence platform that helps advisors identify high-value prospects, map relationships, and deepen clients using real-time data on wealth event networks. And then John O'Connell is the founder of the Oasis Group, a leading consultancy for the wealth management industry that offers award-winning consulting services, industry-leading research, and compelling on-demand training. So thank you all for joining me today. We're going to hold all audience questions until the end of the webinar, but you can submit any questions you have in the chat box or the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. So with that, I want to jump right into the conversation. And John, the first question is for you. There's more data available to advisors today than ever before. And why do you think so many advisors still struggle to use it effectively?
Well, I think that part of the challenge they've got is they're still in stovepipe data storage areas, right? So they're getting data from custodians with daily positions and balances and performance data in a started day file. So that comes in a batch process every morning for them to process. They've got data in their wealth platform with their model portfolios and the way that they're basically investing each one of the accounts. They've got held away account data they may be getting from a variety of different sources. They've got CRM data, so they've got data that they're tracking about their clients within their CRM that's usually tied up these text files, these notes that they've got. They may be using an AI note taker where they've got data now on all the notes that they've taken, action items, summaries of the calls that they've had with their clients. So when you think about it, they've got data kind of in all these different places. And it's really difficult for them to get a 360-degree view of their client, let alone their clients and their accounts and their households and the relationships, right? And we're not even getting into related party data where, if your client uses an accountant or has an attorney or has a trust, all of that is extra data that's sitting out there. And in a lot of cases, that data is locked up in documents that the advisor may get, whether that's tax documents or estate planning or wills, trusts. So there's data laying all over the place for advisors. And I think that they really struggle with, number one, how do you kind of collate all this data? How do you organize it so that you can do anything with it? And that's a huge challenge for advisors today. Not counting the fact, by the way, that these documents are usually stored in some sort of document vault, whether that's Box or, SharePoint or even, God forbid, OneDrive. OneDrive has a lot of backup challenges. I wouldn't store data there. But, they've got data kind of all over the place. So bringing all that data together is super difficult for them. And, then there's other data that's available out there in the marketplace that they can get, right? So that could be data about, for example, the zip code that their client lives in, or the house value that the client has, all of which could provide better financial advice, but all of which is significantly difficult for the advisor to pull together.
Yeah,
So
John,
Dan,
I think that's a great point, John. And I think, if you think about the industry, wealth management today, over the last decade, a number of firms have spent a lot of investment and capital into CRMs and into integration around that. And I think, the advisor adoption of using it as a source of truth just hasn't been there, right? Because it's, not only do you have to put the data in a central place so it's at your fingertips and easy to use, but you need to go to the next step and generate what insights the data is telling us. Just giving me a list of fields and attributes without really having a good understanding of any context or relevance advisors don't find useful. So I think that's the next step. If you really want to get value out of your all the focus around data for these firms, you really have to spend time thinking about how do I interpret it and how do I make it relevant to my conversations.
Absolutely.
So, Dan, I'm going to stick with you. What do you think is driving the shift from traditional relationship building methods to data-enabled approaches in wealth management right now?
I think it's a number of factors, and it goes beyond tech enablement, right? Like with AI and technology is certainly a disruptive force that is lowering the cost of entry and the speed to finding data. But I think there's other forces at play here that are all converging. I think you have changing demographics. The typical advisory client is going to get younger, more diverse, often female-led, digitally fluent, and at the same time, purpose driven is the phrase I like to use. And I think, along with the demographic changing, the expectations are shifting, right? I think I always use the example in my household, we have Netflix, right? And each one of myself and every family member has a membership. You go into it, it shows me what my likes are. And if my daughter logs in next, she sees hers. So that personalization around the client experience and engagement is expected by these newer and younger generations. You couple that with the reality of what the advisors are facing today in economic pressures, right? Fee compression, rising operating costs, slow to non-existent organic growth. It's fundamentally shaping how advisors engage clients. We're moving from volume-based traditional outreach to more focused and relationship by impact approaches. And I think that's a really important thing that data can enable and drive to help you not only, engage with your clients, but engage in a relevant, purposeful way that really resonates with the next generations.
I think one thing there too, Dan, that you kind of called out is I don't necessarily see it as a shift away. Like we do a lot of, customer surveys and interviews with our customers to learn more about what's working well for them. And I don't think you're going to see a move away from relationships. But how can
No.
they leverage relationships in a more meaningful way? And how can they get more insight about their relationships and who else they might be related to and how they might expand their relationship network as well?
I'm
Erica.
reminded. I always have this quote from John Paulson, who's a billionaire hedge fund manager. But the quote was focused on how do you get an edge in investing, but I think it's how do you get an edge as an advisor? You get there through 100% focus, constant digging for information, and more importantly, understanding its relevance in the context that you're doing. The advisors that are going to win the day tomorrow are the ones that combine data intelligence with deep human understanding and, engage proactively in moments that matter with their clients.
Erica, what specific types of data signals are proving most valuable for understanding clients beyond their portfolios? And can you share any examples of insights that surprised you?
Yeah, so some of the most valuable signals are ones that are going to indicate change, not necessarily a static attribute. So you can think of events as a type of intent signal. We hear a lot about, intent. I want to know about customers' intent. And these events are kind of leading indicators that someone is ready or wants or needs to talk about finances. So those life events show up first. You can think about things like career changes, business or liquidity events, moves or property activity. It's a really great indicator of when advisors can lean in and have conversations with clients or prospects. So signals tell you when they're kind of open to advice, when they're ready to talk to you about something going on.
Yeah, and that goes like to Erica's point, right? That goes well beyond, the life events that you see with your client, right? So it's easy to tell, hey, your client's child is, turning 2. Should we talk to them about a 529 account? Think of all the other things that can happen, right? So for example, let's say the company that your client is employed with just announces they're going to have a layoff. That's a huge signal for you to reach out to the client and say, hey, is everything okay? Let's talk about where you're at. You've got a rainy day fund. You've got an emergency fund. We've prepared for something like this. So if anything bad would happen, we're in good shape. That in and of itself can so deepen the relationship between the advisor and the client to a point where that may lead to a referral conversation, right? You could call that client and he says, you know what, I'm fine. Like I wasn't affected with the reduction in force, but a bunch of my friends were. And the advisor can follow up with, well, why don't you have them give me a call? Let me figure out with them, how do we put together a plan so that they can weather this kind of storm? That's a great opportunity. By the way, it had nothing to do with the life event of your client, right? So how do you take data like that, knowing your client works at Oracle and Oracle just had a layoff, how do you correlate that data to deepen the relationship with your client? That's the stuff that's super difficult, but very, very, very impactful.
So John, there are dozens of tools promising to make advisors more efficient. What's the difference between being faster and being better at this type of work?
Well, I think, like, as we're seeing technology really accelerate things, especially with artificial intelligence, I'm pretty fond of saying artificial intelligence is going to get you someplace faster. That might be a brick wall. If your data is not in really good shape, you're just going to get there faster, right? So what I think a lot of advisors need to think about is, what do they want? What kind of signals do they want to see? What do they want to be able to leverage to deepen the relationship with their client? What's their secret sauce or their niche, right? So if you're a generalist advisor and you're working with people that have over $500,000 of investable assets, you need to start really analyzing your existing client base and saying, well, where are my heat maps? Where do I have these pockets of depth that I can begin to really double down on and narrow in on, right? Because if you're an advisor that's sitting here saying, I want to work with someone with over $500,000 in investable assets, you're the exact same thing as the fella next door. So if you're not trying to figure out a way to get niche-y that starts with analyzing your existing clients. If you analyze your existing client base and say, I've got this really large number of clients that are in the technology sector or in the healthcare sector, or maybe I have a ton of people that live in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Like, where's your niche, and then how do you double down on it? And then how do you understand the relationships that you can leverage around that niche client base? So if you've got a bunch of clients that are in, a healthcare setting, then how do I start leveraging that to either put together content that talks to the healthcare sector, or talk to my clients and say, listen, I know I'm working with you, but did you know I'm working with 7 other people that work in the same hospital you do? What's the opportunity for me to go in and do a seminar at the hospital? Or what's the opportunity for me to meet more folks that maybe are in an anesthesiologist group or a surgeon group that works at that hospital? How do you look at these relationships and start really deepening them? That's the real key to unlocking organic growth, not inorganic growth with just the markets going up. If you really want to unlock organic growth, you have to proactively sell, which means you have to proactively understand your client base so that you can get in front of similar clients with a good message that will win you more business. And Dan brought up really the anemic growth that we see kind of across the industry. There's going to be a market correction at some point. When there is, it's going to really separate the people who have an organic growth strategy versus the people who are just kind of riding the market. The people who are riding the market are going to wind up selling their practices really fast as they watch the value of their practice erode because their AUM is being reduced. The people who have an organic growth strategy are going to be able to weather that kind of storm, because sales cures all ills, no matter what business you're in.
I think, listen, I think that's spot on. I think, and to your question, Johnny, about how, what's the difference between efficiency and being better at your job. I think the real difference data can enable, it comes down to, as you said, focus and impact. So many advisors that we work with don't have enough time in their day. It's not a matter of not wanting to, but don't have enough time in the day to scrutinize and understand, their ideal client profile. Like, where are they good? Like, what is resonating with their client base? What are the clients that they enjoy engaging with and are having success with? What do those clients have in common? And then more importantly, how can those clients open up doors and networks to people that fit that profile for them. So I think that is a very powerful way to think about that data can enable. I mean, at the end of the day, it's good to get better at doing something and quicker, but the real advantage isn't volume or speed. It's relevance.
And Dan, I think there's a difference between knowing about a client through data versus truly understanding them. So where does technology help in that, and where does the human advisor remain essential?
It's such an important question to really understand, and there's so many aspects of this that, across what is data, what is accuracy, what is context, right? So I think, at the end of the day, data provides signals, but without the right context, the signals can be misleading. Can be wrong and embarrassing, right? So, there's no one size fits all interpretation. While automation and AI are doing a ton to speed up getting things to your fingertips, insight is only valuable when it's paired with judgment, experience, and conversation with your clients. I always use this example because I find it very esoteric. When I first joined with A Identified, I thought it was remarkable that one of the things that we could filter in is properties that have elevators. And that's an interesting thing to think about, like having a search on. And, but without any context, this group, this prospect, this client recently moved into a property with a new house. Well, with a new house and an elevator. Is that a sign of luxury and discretionary spending that is in abundance, or is that a sign of health and mobility concerns? Like, you need other factors to understand why the client or prospect chose that and how that may play into their concerns about their financial and, security and protection for their family well-being. So, just knowing that they have a house with an elevator, it's nice. Thinking about what it means to them and what it means to you, as thinking about their holistic 360 view of their life as advisors do today, I think that's a really cool way to think about how data is going to enable you to know something about your client, but it's the advisor's job to understand them.
So, Erica, let's talk more about how data intelligence enables more meaningful personalization and what role personalization plays in specifically client retention.
Yeah, absolutely. So personalization is no longer a nice to have. It's kind of a baseline for trust. You heard Dan talking about earlier, right, that when we log into all of these technologies, we expect it to know us. We expect it to understand Erica likes these kinds of things. Erica does not like these other kinds of things. And I don't want to see those things I don't like. Clients aren't leaving advisors just because of performance issues, right? They're leaving when they don't feel seen or understood. So personalization doesn't mean more messages. It doesn't mean more touch points. It just means there's more relevance in those moments that matter, which we've talked about, right? There are events that happen, and understanding those and the context behind them and how to reach out and kind of reestablish that friendship and relationship there. And data insights can help highlight what's relevant now for your client, right? What's going on right now versus what happened 6 months ago. Provides that context before you start a conversation and can help an advisor stay informed and not be as reactive. And sometimes these things are, a directional insight. It's something that we maybe think might happen in the future for someone, and that is just a way to kind of guide those future conversations, right? As we start thinking about, predicting and helping someone identify someone who might have an event occur in the future, it's about how can an advisor take that thoughtfully, like Dan and John, like you guys have talked about, interpret that and have a meaningful conversation with their customers. So it's not necessarily automation replacing relationships. It's just that intelligence supporting a human advisor.
Yeah, just to build on what Erica is saying, I mean, the intelligence really does need to support the deepening of that relationship between the human advisor and their client, right? There's tons of data out there, like literally tons of data out there that you can have on your clients. It's what you're doing with that data to really deepen the relationship that matters, right? So, I mean, think about it. Every advisor could look up any one of their clients on LinkedIn. What are you doing with that data? Are you using it to, for example, look at the job history and say, hey, you've moved a couple of times in jobs. Do you have organized 401ks hanging around out there we should talk about? Are you looking at it to understand their alma mater? Because maybe they're a college football fan or a college basketball fan. You want to be able to have some sort of conversation with them around that, right? It's what are you doing with the data to actually deepen that relationship that matters the most? You've got access to this data in many cases. You know, it's are you leveraging that at all to build their network, understand their network, and then leverage that network? And that's what really matters, right? I mean, if you think about it, you know, knowing that your client works at a specific company is one thing. Are you asking that client, are you following that company to understand what's happening with that company? Are you asking your client to get introduced to other people at that company based on what you know about what's happening at the company? That makes a big difference. Asking a client for a referral is one thing. Saying to the client, look, I know that your stock price is not, you know, has done really, really well. Maybe there's some people that could use financial advice because they've seen a windfall. We could be really helpful for them. We've been helpful for you. Could we be helpful to them? That's a completely different conversation. You're not just asking for a referral for the sake of asking. You're asking for a referral with context about why it makes sense for your client to refer you to somebody. And I think that that's critically important to build out that network and being able to ignite that organic growth engine that you have for your firm. Without it, you're just kind of everybody else. You're just asking for a referral without that additional context or that additional driver.
Great point. And John, for advisors who want to start leveraging data intelligence, what are the first practical steps they should take with their existing book of business?
I think the first thing that they should do is analyze their existing book to understand, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the conversation, some of those heat maps, right? Where do I have a higher degree of clients? Maybe that's their industry, maybe that's their zip code, maybe that's their demographic, maybe that's the company they work at. You know, where are my clients today? Where have I done well? You know, a lot of advisors don't know how their message is resonating with individual groups of clients, right? If you said to a lot of advisors today, look, where do you focus the most? Unless they've got a practice that's specifically focused on a niche, they don't know. So analyzing that data first, and what I would do is I would take your CRM data, export that out, go try to take a look at what demographic are they in, what industry they're in, what companies do they work for, what towns do they live in. Try to understand more about your client, okay? More about each one of your clients. And you don't have to kind of boil the ocean. Pick one thing. You know, if you think that, for example, you've got a high percentage of your clients that are in a specific town or in a specific company, just pick that and focus on that and say, all right, out of my 400 clients, I've got 200 of them work for a specific firm or are in a specific industry. That's a pretty good heat map. 50% of your client base is in a specific area. Once you've identified that gravity of clients, that heat map that says, here's where I've got a really good percentage of clients. Once you've identified that, then you need to begin to say, how do I build an organic growth engine around that? How do I leverage those relationships? Or how do I create a network around that set of clients? Now there's ways that you could do that by just talking to the clients and saying for a referral. You may start following that company. You could use a tool like Identify to try to understand the network around that set of clients, and then start building that out and figuring out how do you want to grow how do you want to ignite that organic growth engine that we talked about. So don't boil the, if I can summarize, don't boil the ocean. Start with your CRM data. Start with a hunch, validate that. It's almost like scientific method, right? Start with a hypothesis. This is where I think I've got a concentration of clients. Test that by taking a look at how many clients do I have in that concentration versus my entire client base. If I don't have a really high percentage, your hypothesis wasn't that great. Pick a different hypothesis. Once you've gotten that that locked in, then start figuring out, how do I leverage that information now? How do I leverage that knowledge to build a network around those clients, and then start organically growing from there?
Mm.
And I love that
I
you
would
called that out,
go ahead,
John,
Erica.
because some of our, I'm pretty sure some of our most successful clients that utilize our platform, when we've talked with them, they are relentless. Like, they know exactly who their core customer, what they look like. And I mean, they are absolutely willing to say no. Like, I'm not even going to talk to that person. They don't match what I'm looking for. And having that kind of relentless, yes, this is the right type of person, no, this isn't, I think has been helpful for those clients, right? Making them, very relevant to their customers. So yeah, I absolutely agree.
I would just add to that too. I think, maybe a piece of advice that I give to advisors that want to start thinking about that, you need to go into it with a little bit of humility, and it's humbling, right? To think about, I may not resonate well with a certain demographic. I may not be very, I may succeed in some areas where I think, personally, I think do well across everything, but let the data show you your strengths and show you areas you can work. And I think we get the question all the time, hey, I've had clients for 20 plus years. I think you can always learn something about them, right? And I think research has shown, especially in the high net worth space, like close to 70% of wealthy individuals work with multiple advisors. So, you can always spend the extra time learning and digging and knowing more about, your clients, even if they're existing clients, and thinking about then how do I engage them differently to kind of become the majority of what they're using for advisor practice.
To build on one thing that Erica said a moment ago, if you've got that relentless focus on a specific client base, what you're going to find is your operations costs actually decrease. And the reason is because many of your clients that you're going after, it's always the outlier that's going to be harder for you to service well. So it's going to be more expensive for you to service the client that's so far afield from what your niche, that it's just really difficult to resonate with them, and it's really difficult to service them. And what you're going to find is they're probably one of your noisier clients, right? So it's better to let that client go and focus on your niche, because that's where you're going to get, number one, you're going to get better growth, and number two, you're probably going to be able to have a lower cost of service for that set of clients. There's an old saying in sales: if you try to sell to everyone, you're going to sell to nobody. So if you're not focused, as hard as that may seem, and it is scary when you're owning a business to try to focus on that, but once you do, you're going to find there's this enormous amount of abundance within that client base. So try not to sell to everyone, because you're not going to sell to everyone very well.
So, Erica, next one's for you. If you could change one thing about how advisors approach finding new clients today, what would it be?
So I feel like I'm just going to sound like I echo John completely, because I think I'd shift away from casting a really wide net and recognizing patterns that already exist, right? So we have a lot of, especially newer advisors, they're focused a lot on volume, on too many cold starts, and not necessarily enough alignment and understanding where their core competencies lie. So the best advisors know what their clients look like. They understand their ideal income or life stage or mindset, and they value quality way over quantity, right? They would rather have fewer really high quality leads than a ton that they have to work through. And our data can help identify that, right? It can identify patterns across your existing clients. One of our top priorities right now is trying to help with that ideal client profile, right? Like, how can we help our clients with that more? How can we surface relationships and connection paths that are of value, that can help them, again, grow in a more organic, natural way based on whatever their niche is. I mean, if you think about it, relationships, we've talked about them a lot today. They're still essential. Over 60% of new business comes from a relationship. So data is not going to replace that. It's going to strengthen that. This is not about faster prospecting. We want to make sure that advisors are more aligned, have warmer introductions, right? But again, are focused on their sort of core competencies, their niche, and not so much just a wide net that they're casting.
And so I have one question left for our panelists from my list of questions, and then we're going to move on to some audience questions. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, feel free to put them either in the chat box or the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. But Dan, last one for you here. What does the relationship between advisors and data look like 5 years from now?
In short, it will become an integral part of your daily processes and just activity, right? I think, but to really understand like what is a relationship between advisor and data look like in 5 years, you got to think about what the advisor's relationship with their clients is going to look like in 5 years and what's driving that. And it's sometimes a difficult conversation, but like if I often think about that relationship. I think about my own kids who are teenagers right now. They're certainly going to be in a different position than I was at their age. And I'm not talking financially, like in terms of their expectations, the tools that are available to them, the things they can research on their own at their fingertips that is going to be inaccurate, misleading, confusing, and conflicting, that they're going to need help navigating. And in this generation, there are going to be a lot of kids in their 20s and 30s starting families, buying houses, looking insurance, may not have an older generation around to ask those questions of. And they're going to kind of be navigating this on their own. And I think that's where, I said earlier, like an advisor of tomorrow is going to be a life coach for a lot of these individuals. And to beyond just where should I invest, but like what should I think about when I think about insurance? What should I think about when I think about, health and wellness? What should I think about when I think about, activities that I want my family to be interested in? And, it's really important that the advisor is using data to make sure that they have the right questions and right engagement with those clients of tomorrow that are going to want that engagement. I think Eric, you said it earlier. People don't necessarily leave on performance. You can be very well, but if you're not connecting and you're not being heard, you're not being serviced, right? And I think that's where I think that's how data can help advisors in the future.
And as a data person, like I think data is it's going to still be essential, right? It is the cornerstone of what all of us do anyway. We've just found a way to digitize it finally. And I think that, ideally, John, you talked earlier about how data is so disparate and it's in all of these different places. So ideally, 5 years from now, it looks easier, right, for everyone to access, for you to find connections, to figure out how you get the insights from the data, and that becomes faster and easier, and then it makes it more natural to manage those relationships with clients.
I want to build on something Dan just said a moment ago. So I've got a very good friend of mine right now who's actually leaving his advisor and going to another advisor, right? So throughout his life, his family has, like, there was some financial challenges his family had earlier in their lifetime, and so because of that, he likes to have a bunch of cash on hand, right? He wants to have that rainy day fund. It just needs to be there. He's finally fed up with the fact that his advisor keeps saying to him he needs to invest that money, right? So there's a certain portion. So now we're into a little bit of behavioral finance. There's a certain portion that he needs to have his cash for him to feel safe, full stop. So his advisor does not hear him and is not listening to him. And because of that, he is now going to move a fairly substantial, portfolio away from that advisor, right? And the reason is because, the advisors had tons of conversations with him, right? If the advisor had read any of the notes, probably in his CRM, he would realize that this conversation comes up literally like every 6 months. Wanted to invest the money. I don't want to because I need to have this safety net. I feel safe with this money, right? So the advisor sounds like a broken record because he just keeps coming back to what the advisor wants. The advisor wants that money invested. Now, let's not dive into the whole AUM issue, right? Of where that, the advisor is going to get fees if the money's invested, yada, 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 yada. The reality of it is the advisor is not listening to their client. And because of that, because the client doesn't feel heard, The client is going to move their entire portfolio. That's a really great example of how do you use data that you already have to deepen your client relationship. Had you reviewed that data, had it not been locked up in notes in a CRM that you didn't look at before you got on the phone with the client, you would know that that client has a certain propension to have cash on hand. And that propensity to have cash on hand means that you should not bring up reinvesting that cash every time you have a conversation with them. So there's a great example of, that's not even trying to draw a correlation between the data, that's just literally leveraging the data they already have in a more interesting way to avoid what is now a car accident with this relationship with the client. Now, take that and really extrapolate it, right? And say, how do I do that at scale across my client base? How do I leverage all this information I know across my clients? And that's where I think you're going to see artificial intelligence playing a huge role. Dan mentioned a moment ago, the expectations of the next generation of investors are significantly higher than my generation's expectations with their advisor. I mean, look, in this particular example, had the advisor just reviewed CRM notes, he could have saved the relationship. Now imagine the next generation investor who at a moment's notice is asking, do you remember that I had this conversation with you 2 months ago? Because I remember it. Do you remember it? You know, that's where the speed and access of information is going to really set the stage for that client relationship moving forward. Because Dan's children, my children, they're going to expect that when they talk to their advisor remembers all those conversations. That's where things like the new tools that are coming out around artificial intelligence will be able to surface that information for you much quicker if you use it. If you don't use it, you're going to simply lose clients, right? And now, you know, one of the things that I think, you know, now I'm going to switch gears for a moment to something Erica said a moment ago about, you know, if you could change how advisors are currently approaching their clients, what would you do? I look at a lot of the aggregation firms, and they're buying all these advisory practices. But are you enabling those advisory practices to leverage information to grow their business, right? So if you're buying someone who's growing at 3%, guess what's going to happen tomorrow? They're going to grow at 3%. Unless you change something, that growth trajectory has been there for 5 to 10 years. It's not going to change. So how do you enable the advisors that you're bringing into an ensemble or into an aggregation practice to really analyze their data and understand their niche? And are you, as Erica pointed out a moment ago, if you're willing to walk away from a client that doesn't fit your business, think of you as an aggregator CEO. Are you willing to say that lead doesn't go to John, that lead goes to Erica because it is more in alignment with Erica's existing client base? So as an aggregator, you need to think to yourself, am I analyzing the data across all these businesses that I've purchased? Am I helping them to understand their niche? Am I having the fortitude to send prospects to the advisor that has the highest probability of closing that business? And if the answers to all of those are no, then I think you really need to re-examine the growth model that you have as an aggregator. Because at some point, the private equity money that you're bringing on board to aggregate these businesses is going to dry up. The private equity firm is going to expect to see outpaced growth from your contemporaries. And if you're not taking the steps to analyze data today to put yourself on that outpaced growth trajectory, I think you're going to be in a lot of trouble tomorrow.
Well said. And we do have a couple audience questions, but first, I was informed that during the intro, my connection was a little laggy, so I want to do one more plug for each of our panelists really quick. So Dan Kavanaugh is the General Manager of Wealth Management and Financial Advisory at A Identified, and Erica Maynard is the SVP and Head of Data as a Service at A Identified, which is an AI-powered wealth network intelligence platform that helps advisors identify high-value prospects, map relationships, and deepen client connections using real-time data on wealth events, lifestyle signals, and professional networks. And then John O'Connell is the founder of the Oasis Group, which is a leading consultancy for the wealth management industry. And so I want to move on to a couple audience questions we have here. And first one is, do I need to be tech savvy to use these platforms effectively, or are they designed for advisors who aren't particularly technical?
You want to take that, Erica? Should I take that? How do you want to do that?
Sure. No, and I think if you did have to be particularly technical, we'd be doing our job wrong. So good platforms are going to try and hide as much of the complexity from you as possible. We're trying to do a lot of the data science behind the scenes for you and give our clients clear signals and context and reduce as much friction as possible.
I have to agree with Erica. I think that, a lot of the platforms we see today really are hiding an enormous amount of data science complexity behind the scenes, and they're doing an excellent job at that. So no, I don't think you need to be particularly tech savvy. I do think that you need to be somewhat forward thinking. You do need to recognize that you want to have an outpaced growth strategy beyond your competitors. And then you've got to make that decision to invest time and energy to achieve that, right? Like any new tool is going to require some training for you to use it effectively. You're not just going to pick up a wrench and know exactly how to use it. So you've got to be able to take a step back as the owner of the business and say, this is a direction that we're going to move in. We're going to slice some time away. We're going to invest that time to learn this tool and put ourselves in a position that is going to change the direction of our company. So no, I don't think you need to be tech savvy, but I do think you need to be intentional in the fact that you're going to use that tool to do something different.
And I think, to play on that, especially as Erica said, like we intentionally spend a lot of time thinking about, as we develop tools and capabilities and solutions for advisors, how does it fit naturally into how do they work today, right? Like that is a really important part of product and product strategy. Is just, we don't want to turn advisors into technologists. We want to enhance their day and their judgment capabilities, and we don't want to complicate it, right? So that's a heavy focus, and it's a heavy focus for many software providers today.
All right, so here's an interesting one. What happens when the data is wrong or incomplete, and how can advisors avoid embarrassing situations based on faulty information?
I think the answer, I'll start this one off. I think the answer is it's in the spirit of everything we've been talking about, like really understanding what do we mean by data and what do you mean by data accuracy and how can data be wrong? Not, first thing is, not all data is equal, right? Some data is finite, highly reliable. What's my address? What's my age? What's my name, right? Other data is inferred. It's based on patterns. It's based on probability, could be deterministic data that it gives you a signal or insight rather than certainty. And I think it's so important that advisors distinguish, the difference that data plays. It's not providing an absolute truth. There is no one answer. It is there to provide you signals that you are going to interpret and understand in the context of everything else you know about your clients. I think when advisors approach data this way, it really becomes a powerful input for their preparation, their analysis, and their engagement with their clients. I think, as John said earlier, I love the example, right? You already know some of this stuff. It's in your notes. But did you take the time to surface the key points that you already know, and then take a minute to understand what that's telling you about the data you already know? I think that's how I think about, what's the, how do you deal with data? It's a part of the equation.
Yeah, and from the data science side of things, it's why understanding the probabilistic data matters, right? It's not an account balance, it's not stock market prices. Like this is not, where it is accurate to, every degree, every second. At scale, no data set is going to be 100% perfect. We're looking at multiple sources of data. Sometimes there's not a single point of the truth, as Dan was saying. So we're going to try and give our customers confidence scores and thresholds and help them understand how confident we're feeling in pieces of data to help them feel more confident in it as well, right? Being as upfront and honest and telling you, this may be a good way to contact someone, but maybe we do have a little, maybe we have some, maybe we're unsure of exactly how well a particular method might work versus another one that we're very certain is likely to work.
And I'm going to just weigh in from, again, just to put a sales hat on, right? What you're trying to use this data for is to start a conversation, That's really the purpose of the data, right? So the ability to start that conversation, if the data is faulty, people love to tell you you're wrong, okay? They love telling you you're wrong. So that's actually a sales tactic, believe it or not. There's a sales methodology called the big fat claim, where you basically say, I can save you X amount of money by doing this. And what will happen is if they don't believe that, the prospect will say, no, you're wrong. You can't save us that much money. Really? Why? Help me to understand, where did we get this incorrect, right? What's the cost of your resources compared to what this technology can do? You know, that's where now you're having a conversation about, and you're learning things. How much do their internal resources cost? How does that weigh against the software cost? Where can an ROI be? You're establishing a conversation based on that, right? So I think that I would not worry about an embarrassing situation around the data. If you were to say to someone, hey, you know what, we've taken a look at a lot of our data and we have this, I'd like to talk to you about this particular point. You know, does this affect you? Is this accurate? They'll tell you you're wrong 100% of the time. So if you're not starting the conversation, you're never going to know whether it was right. So start the conversation. If it's incorrect, they will tell you that. You now have a conversation going, and you can move forward from there. So I don't think that you should worry about any of this data being wrong. What you should worry about is not having a conversation at all.
It's a great point.
Yeah. And so with anything related to financial advisors, compliance is always a main concern. So another question here, what are the compliance considerations? Does my firm's compliance department need to approve these types of tools before I can use them?
You know, in my experience, you know, every firm is different, but in most cases, advisors may prefer, not expect, but may prefer their firm to do their due diligence and approve a tool that they're using. So, you know, and I think, you know, not only the tools, but the vendors, the companies that they're working with. So, and I think what's interesting, and today with KYC and a number of factors that are increasing regulation and compliance concerns and risk in the space, we're seeing an increasing interest in platforms like ours helping compliance teams. You know, when used correctly, it doesn't create friction for them. It can help you support stronger documentation and rationale for outreach and campaigns and more consistent oversight on how you're engaging with your clients. So I think, you know, when implemented properly, these tools don't just pass compliance, they can actually help with it.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in just one more piece on that. You know, whenever you're leveraging data to understand your client more effectively or understand your prospect, you're going to get a deeper understanding of the person that stands behind that, right? So manufactured people have no histories, or certainly not deep histories. So from a KYC perspective, the more you know about your client, the more effectively you can service them and the more accurate your information can be around them. So I would encourage any firm that's going to leverage these types of tools, of course, do your vendor due diligence, you know, check their cybersecurity capability and go along those lines. But from a compliance perspective, I would look at some of these tools not as, you know, am I reaching out to the right people, but really look at them as, I'm actually going to have a much more targeted outreach program. And I'm going to be targeting people that have a history, that have multiple data points around them. So you're much less likely to have an AML issue if you're doing this type of thing, because you're going to know a heck of a lot more about that prospect even before you're reaching out to them. So I do think that if you take a look at this from that perspective, you're going to have a much more accurate prospect list. It's not going to be as like you're just cold emailing people. You're going to have a much more accurate prospect list. And in that way, I think it reduces the risk of the firm.
Right. I'm not seeing any more questions. So we're going to wrap up for today, but thank you to all three of you for this really insightful discussion today. Before we go, I want to hear more about where people can follow your work and learn more. So John, you cover data intelligence topics and so many other relevant topics for advisors. Where can they follow your work?
So you can follow pretty much everything we have on the website. So that's www.theoasisgrp.com. And also follow us on LinkedIn, because every article that I'm quoted in or anything like that shows up on our social media on LinkedIn.
Dan, Erica, where can people learn more about A-Identified?
I think using the website sounds like a great start. It's www.aidentified.com.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much to all three of you, and thank you to everyone who joined us today, and we will catch you next time.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.